So hi, my name is Kaya Chatterjee. I'm with the World Wildlife Fund in the U.S., and two of us are going to be speaking today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the emerging economy perspective, what they're doing on climate change and why they're doing it. And then Kim Carstensen, who's the lead of our climate change program internationally at World Wildlife Fund, is going to talk about the connections to what's happening here in Pittsburgh and the G20 process and the overall negotiations. So here in the U.S. in particular, we hear a lot of myths about the role of emerging economies on climate change. There seems to be a myth out there that countries like China and countries like India are not doing anything about climate change. And the truth could not be more different from that. And particularly if in comparison to where the U.S. is, we see an incredible amount of action by some of these countries. And while it's important to realize that these numbers are out there, because what we often hear is that developing countries somehow aren't doing enough. And it just couldn't be further from the truth. And I just want to talk a little bit now about why they're doing it. And they're doing it for the same reasons that countries like ours should be doing it. We've kind of come halfway to a piece of legislation in the U.S. in that the U.S. House has passed a piece of legislation. We don't yet have a Senate-passed piece of legislation, although we are expecting that the first version of that bill will be introduced next week. But we are not there. We don't actually have these laws in place yet, and yet these countries do. And it's for the same reasons that we tell our leaders that they need to act. It's because the costs of inaction are very, very high in these countries. There are large populations of very vulnerable people in India, in China, who are reliant on natural resources and are already feeling the impacts of climate change. And because of that, leaders of those countries realize that they need to move. They're doing it also because it's in their economic best interest. You can see it in India and China, the countries that are raised the most in the U.S., there's economic growth in the renewable energy sectors of those economies. They're really moving forward. They're talking about wind and solar energy at the level of their heads of state, but their private sector is also moving forward and implementing programs and projects all over their countries and also exporting goods in these sectors. And so they've realized it's in their economic best interest to act, and so they're doing it. And I think one of the reasons that they've talked about very recently about why they're acting so stringently on climate change is very interesting. And they're starting to use this language that they're calling the bluff of industrialized countries. The industrialized countries, have used them as an excuse for long enough, and they're basically calling their bluff. They're saying, okay, well, we're now doing what you've asked us to do. We never had the level of historic responsibility for this issue, and we're doing it. So now let's see if countries are going to come forward, the industrialized countries, and also do their part. So that's what I would sort of categorize as the main motivations for why they're acting. And so I'm going to now pass it to Kim to give you some sense of how that fits into the conversations that are happening here and in the coming weeks. Well, I think that we got a lot of positive words out of the G20, similar to how we heard a lot of good things being said in the UN General Assembly Forum on climate change earlier this week. And now what we're all looking for is for those words to be translated into actions. And we don't have a lot of time. We only have 10 weeks until the climate summit happens in Copenhagen. So between now and then, we really need the finance ministers to take what they've done, which is very important. And remember, we have finance ministers who are talking about economic issues on a day-in, day-out basis, all of a sudden coming to terms with the fact that climate change is going to be a huge cost to their economies and thinking about how to deal with this. So it's a big step, but what we need them to do is actually come up with these specific climate finance packages that are going to make sure that we get this global clean energy economy going and that we have the money that we need to protect the vulnerable people around the world who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change.
So is that specifically what you would say needs to be done to get a deal in Copenhagen at the Copenhagen Summit?
Yeah, and to get a deal at the Copenhagen Summit, we absolutely need finance ministers and heads of state to come forward from the industrialized countries, from the countries that have resources, and put the money down, the down payment, to make sure that we create these clean energy jobs around the world, and we create this global economy that's clean, so that we get economies of scale, so that we don't just have one or two countries creating specific items that we need for energy efficiency, for renewable energy, but we're actually doing it globally. And then again, the other piece of this is that we do need countries that have the resources to protect the really vulnerable people who we have put in a very bad situation. They're now having to deal with increases in storm intensity, with saline intrusions that's affecting their agricultural outputs. In some places, there are glacial lakes forming from the glaciers melting, and these lakes are bursting and flooding villages. We need to make sure that those people have resources to cope with the impacts that they're experiencing, and that's got to happen before Copenhagen, because it's very hard to expect poor developing countries to completely change the way they do poverty alleviation unless countries that have resources can say, you know what, we're going to support you in doing it, and we're going to do it ourselves. Everybody deserves access to clean energy, and so we do need to understand that there's slightly different circumstances in different countries. We also need to understand that in industrialized countries, there's a huge onus on us to make sure that we get rid of these subsidies on all sides of the equation. So not just in terms of what the consumer end, but also in terms of the production end. We make sure that we're not subsidizing the wrong things.